In the winter of 1781, the army that would become the United States was falling apart. George Washington's troops had marched south toward a town in Virginia called Yorktown, where the entire war, the whole improbable gamble of American independence, was about to be decided. But the soldiers had not been paid. They were hungry, some of them barefoot, and they were on the edge of mutiny. Washington needed $20,000 to hold his army together long enough to fight. He turned to his superintendent of finance, Robert Morris, and Morris gave him an answer that should have ended the revolution right there. There was no money. The treasury was empty. The government's paper currency was worthless. There was no credit left to draw on anywhere. And in that moment, with the fate of a nation hanging on a sum of money that did not exist, Washington is said to have given a 3-word order: send for Haym Salomon. Within days, the money was found. The army held. The march to Yorktown went on, and that campaign won the war. And the man who found the money, a Jewish immigrant, who had arrived in America with almost nothing, who had been imprisoned twice, sentenced to death once, and who would die a few years later so poor he was buried in an unmarked grave, was written almost entirely out of the story he helped make possible. This is the story of Haym Salomon. And by the end, I think you will be asking the same question I did. How was this man ever forgotten? To understand how he ended up at the center of the American Revolution, you have to understand where he came from, because his family had already survived one catastrophe before he was ever born. Haym Salomon was born in 1740 in the town of Leszno in Poland into a Jewish family. But his roots did not begin there. His was a Sephardic family, descendants of the Jews of Spain. The community that had been expelled in 1492 scattered across the world and had slowly migrated eastward into Poland over the generations that followed. So the boy born in that Polish town already carried, in his name and his blood, the memory of one of history's great expulsions. His people knew what it meant to lose everything to a government that decided they did not belong. That inheritance of exile, of survival, of starting over with nothing, would shape everything he did. As a young man, Salomon left Poland and traveled across Western Europe, and in those years he learned 2 things that would change his life: the intricate world of finance and a remarkable command of languages. By the time he was grown, he could reportedly operate in English, Hebrew, Polish, Russian, French, German, Spanish, and Italian. He was a man built, almost by accident, for exactly the role history was about to hand him. In 1775, Salomon arrived in New York City. The timing could not have been more dramatic. The American Revolution was igniting that very year. And Salomon, an immigrant who had been in the country for barely a moment, did not sit on the sidelines. He chose a side immediately, and it was the dangerous one. He joined the New York branch of the Sons of Liberty, the secret revolutionary network that worked to undermine British control of the colonies. This was not a safe political opinion. It was a commitment that could get a man hanged. And in 1776, it nearly did. That year, a great fire tore through New York City, destroying a huge portion of the housing the occupying British army needed. The British were certain it was sabotage, and they rounded up the members of the Sons of Liberty they could find. Salomon was among those arrested, charged as a spy. Now here is where the documented record and the patriotic legend begin to blur, and because this channel cares about the truth, I will tell you exactly where that line is. We cannot prove what Salomon did or did not do in that fire. What we can prove is what the British believed, that this man was not just a merchant, but a dangerous enemy agent, operating inside their occupied city. And rather than execute him, they made a calculated decision, because Salomon had a skill they desperately needed. The British army was fighting alongside thousands of Hessian mercenaries, German soldiers who spoke no English. The British had almost no one who could translate. So they pardoned the spy and put him to work as an interpreter for the Germans. It was the worst mistake they could have made, because Salomon used that position placed by his enemies, right in the middle of their own army, to quietly work against them. He encouraged Hessian soldiers to desert. He helped American prisoners escape. The translator the British trusted was running an underground operation against them the entire time. It could not last. In 1778, Salomon was arrested again, And this time the charge was far more serious. He was sentenced to death. And here the story nearly ends, except that somehow he escaped. The details are lost to history, but the outcome is not. A condemned man slipped out of British-held New York and fled south to Philadelphia. He left behind everything he had built. His property was confiscated. His wife and his infant son were left behind in the chaos. He arrived in Philadelphia with nothing for the second time in his life. A member of his family starting over from zero, stripped of everything by a government that called him an enemy. It should have been the end of him. Instead, it was the beginning of the most important work of his life. In Philadelphia, Salomon rebuilt himself with astonishing speed, re-establishing his brokerage and his reputation. And it was there that he came into the orbit of Robert Morris, the superintendent of finance for the new American government, the man with the impossible job of paying for a revolution. The young United States was, financially, a disaster. Its currency was nearly worthless. Foreign governments were quietly lending support, but turning those foreign loans and bills of exchange into usable cash required someone with deep financial skill, international connections, and above all trust. That someone was Haym Salomon. Morris's own diaries record dozens upon dozens of transactions with him, entry after entry reading, in effect, "I sent for Haym Salomon." He brokered the bills of exchange that converted French and Dutch and Spanish support into money the government could actually spend. He sold government securities that, frankly, should have been impossible to sell, asking people to invest in a government that might not exist by the end of the year, and succeeding because his personal reputation was good enough to make them believe. Now, I want to be careful and honest here, because the legend of Haym Salomon has grown over the centuries into something bigger than the facts can support, and a channel that paraphrases myth as truth is not worth your time. You will hear it said that Haym Salomon single-handedly financed the American Revolution. That is not accurate, and the real story does not need the exaggeration. He was not a one-man treasury. Robert Morris was the indispensable architect of revolutionary finance, and French aid, Dutch loans, taxes, and the sacrifice of ordinary soldiers all carried the war. What Salomon was, and this is remarkable enough, was the broker of trust at the moment trust had nearly run out. He was the man who could make the machinery of money actually turn when it had seized up. And he did something else, something the records make unmistakably clear, something that reveals exactly what kind of man he was. He used his own money to keep the revolution's leaders afloat. Some of the most important founders of the United States were, during the war, personally broke. They were serving a government that could not pay them, neglecting their own affairs while they built a nation. And Haym Salomon quietly kept them going out of his own pocket. James Madison, who would become the fourth president of the United States and the father of the Constitution, wrote that he was forced to rely on the kindness of, in his words, his little friend in Philadelphia, Salomon, and that he resorted to it with great mortification. Because Salomon obstinately rejects all recompense. Read that again. The man who shaped the Constitution of the United States was being kept financially alive by a Jewish immigrant who refused to let him pay it back. Salomon extended these interest-free loans to Madison, to Thomas Jefferson, to other leaders of the cause, asking nothing in return. He had arrived in this country a penniless immigrant, twice stripped of everything, and he was now personally underwriting the survival of the men founding the nation. And this is where the story turns, and where it should make you angry. Haym Salomon poured his money, his skill, and his reputation into the American cause, and the cause did not pay him back. When he died in January of 1785, just 2 years after the war ended, he was only 44 years old. The hardships of his imprisonment had wrecked his health, and despite all the money he had advanced, all the loans he had made, all the founders he had personally sustained, he died penniless. The government owed his estate a fortune, by some accounts more than $600,000, an immense sum for the time, and it was never repaid. There was not even enough money for a headstone. Haym Salomon, the broker who helped keep the revolution's finances alive, was buried in an unmarked grave in the cemetery of Philadelphia's Mikveh Israel Synagogue, a synagogue he himself had helped fund. His wife and children were left with nothing but a debt the nation refused to honor. His family spent generations trying to collect, They petitioned Congress again and again across the 19th century. Committees reviewed the claims, agreed that the debt was real and ought to be paid, and then, somehow, nothing ever happened. The documents Salomon had turned over to the government disappeared. At one point, the family offered to settle for a fraction of what was owed, and even that was refused. In 1893, Congress recommended striking a gold medal in his honor. That came to nothing too. A man who had given everything to the founding of the country could not, in death, get either his money or his memory back from it. And that brings us to the strangest part of all the erasure. There is no portrait of Haym Salomon. No bust, no sculpture made from life, no death mask. We genuinely do not know what his face looked like. Every image you have ever seen of him is an artist's invention. For a man so central to the financial survival of the revolution, the historical record is astonishingly thin, a scattering of diary entries, letters, and second-hand accounts. Part of that is the nature of his work. Brokers worked in the shadows, in trust and quiet arrangements, rather than public ledgers. But part of it is something harder to forgive. As America built its national mythology in the 19th and 20th centuries, its monuments, its textbooks, its pantheon of founders, Haym Salomon was left in the margins. Occasionally remembered, periodically rediscovered, but never given the permanent place that men who did far less for the cause received automatically. It took until 1925 for a sitting president, Calvin Coolidge, to publicly call him what he was, and even then, the recognition faded. There is a monument in Chicago where he stands beside Washington and Morris, and it is one of the few places in America where you will find his name carved in stone at all. So why was he forgotten? You can decide for yourself. Maybe it was simply that brokers and financiers never get the glory that generals do. Maybe it was the thinness of the records. Or maybe it had something to do with the fact that the man who helped fund American liberty was a Jewish immigrant, a member of a people that the new nation, for all its talk of freedom, was not yet ready to fully embrace. What we know for certain is this: a Sephardic Jew, descended from families expelled from Spain, who arrived in America with nothing, who was imprisoned and condemned, and who escaped, who used his own fortune to keep the founders of the United States afloat, and asked for nothing back. That man died in an unmarked grave, and his country never paid its debt to him, in money or in memory. His story raises a question that goes far beyond one man. How many others are there? How many people whose names never made the textbooks shaped the world we live in, and were quietly erased because of who they were, or where they came from, or what they believed? That question is the entire reason this channel exists. We dig up the hidden histories, the buried bloodlines, the people the official story left out. And for so many of you watching, that buried history is not just out there in the archives, it is in your own family, in a surname, a tradition, a story that was never fully explained. If you have ever wondered whether your own family carries a hidden chapter like this one, we built a complete kit to help you trace it, your Jewish roots. A step-by-step discovery guide, with a companion database of hundreds of documented Jewish surnames you can check your own name against. If this story stirred something in you, that is where to begin. The link is in the description and the pinned comment. Haym Salomon has been gone for more than 2 centuries, and in a way, the erasure continues, because even now, most Americans have never heard his name. But you have, and maybe that is how a debt like this one finally starts to be paid. Not in gold, but in remembering. Tell me in the comments if you had ever heard of him before today, and tell me which part of his story struck you hardest: the imprisonment, the loans he refused to be repaid for, or the unmarked grave. If these are the stories you want more of, the buried ones, the people history tried to forget, then consider subscribing, and follow that link if you want to start uncovering your own family's hidden history. That is the real reason we are here. Thank you for watching. Until next time, every people has a story they were never told. Haym Salomon was one of them. Maybe your family is another.